simply crumbled into dust. The green fruit, which should have been the size of a walnut, was wrinkled like old bark clinging to a stone. With just a slight brush, they fell and scattered. Aunt Annie collapsed onto the scorching earth, clutching her knees and bursting into loud sobs, crying out that everything was over and begging the heavens for help. She cried out that this money was meant for her husband's dialysis in the second half of the year, and for her grandson's middle school tuition in town this autumn. To buy fertilizer, she still owed $20,000 to the bank. If she didn't irrigate and these trees died of thirst, her entire family would have nothing left. Aunt Annie's weeping was like a signal, completely shattering the psychological defenses of the entire village. Someone shouted from the village entrance, declaring they couldn't take it anymore. Even if the water bills ruined them, they had to save the trees. First, hundreds of families ran like mad toward their own orchards, their eyes bloodshot with desperation. Regardless of the cost, they pulled out those smart cards they once considered a symbol of high technology, and with trembling hands, they swiped them through the readers. The sound of cards clicking echoed incessantly across the parched hills as hundreds of valves were simultaneously cranked to the maximum by the desperate villagers. Everyone watched the black plastic pipes in the dirt, waiting for that expensive, nutrient-rich water to flow. But from the pipes, only a few dull thuds of trapped air emerged. Immediately after, the valve mouth spat out 2 jets of yellow, sandy water and then went completely still. Not a single drop of water would come out. They wondered what had happened to the supply. One man had just loaded $850 onto his card, money meant for food, only to find the system provided by the Lu Yuan company was failing them when they needed it most. The situation was becoming dire as the machinery remained silent. The villagers stood in shock, their hope for survival fading as the technology proved useless. And so, the silence over the dry fields became truly deafening. We see the machinery struggling under the immense pressure of the moment. The body of the machine was so incredibly hot that a wave of heat hit anyone who dared to get close. Back when Alex was in charge, the village used a pure copper industrial motor, a machine with enough power and torque that even if the entire village opened their valves at once to irrigate hundreds of acres, it could steadily pump deep groundwater all the way to the hilltop. But the Lu Yuan company, in their infinite wisdom to cut costs and squeeze out profits, had brought in this so-called high-tech pump. In reality, it was nothing more than a low-quality, assembled mess, with a power rating that was, to be perfectly honest, gravely overestimated. Normally, when only a dozen households took turns irrigating, it could barely manage to scrape by. But now, with hundreds of valves suddenly thrown open, the pressure in the pipe network spiked instantly. This cheap pump was now forced to operate under an extreme and dangerous overload. Someone screamed to shut off the main switch and cut the power immediately. They knew it was going to explode, but as it turned out, it was already far too late. A dull, violent explosion echoed from deep within the pump room. Then, a series of blinding blue electrical sparks erupted from the thick, black smoke. That high-end pump that Uncle Ian had praised to the high heavens was now completely destroyed, and with it, the hopes of hundreds of village families were shattered. The following morning arrived far too early for those who hadn't slept. Very early the next day, the regional manager of the Lu Yuan company, a man named Mr. Wallace, arrived slowly at the village in a brand-new black sedan. He simply kicked the remains of the pump, now nothing more than scrap metal, with his polished leather shoes. Uncle Ian rushed over as if he were greeting his own father, practically bowing before Mr. Wallace. He desperately explained that trouble had arrived, as the machine had suddenly exploded the previous day. He insisted that they couldn't be left without water, urging the manager to look at the damage. With the drought worsening, he knew the fruit trees simply couldn't wait any longer. He begged the company to send a team of engineers and a new machine to replace the broken one. Replace the machine? Mr. Wallace asked if Ian had lost his mind entirely. He told them to read the manual, claiming they had been warned 1,000 times when they received their cards. This precision equipment, he argued, was never meant to operate under such a simultaneous overload. He called it an illegal operation, labeling the incident as malicious damage caused by the users themselves. They had destroyed a high-tech smart device worth over 100,000, and now they expected the company to replace it for free. He asked them, quite mockingly, if they thought this was a charity. Upon hearing this, the villagers erupted in anger, refusing to accept the blame for the breakdown. In this drought, everyone needed to irrigate. The old machine handled hundreds of families at once without ever breaking. It was clear to them that this new machine was cheap and fake. After all, they paid a fortune for maintenance. Yet now that the pump was broken, the company refused to repair it. Mr. Wallace told them to shut up, suggesting that if they wanted to talk about the law, they should follow the contract. Since the equipment was destroyed by their own illegal operation, he laid out his terms for the return of the water. First, the entire village would have to pay compensation for the destroyed pump, plus the cost of purchasing and installing a new one, $30,000 in total. Second, to prevent this from happening again, to prevent further sabotage and losses to the company, the estimated water rates for the second half of the year, along with website maintenance and online platform service fees totaling $20,000, would be added to the bill. In total, $50,000 had to be paid up front and in a single installment directly into the company's account. Only after an official bank transfer for the full amount was received would the pump be replaced. He warned that if they were short even a penny, they could watch their mountain fruit trees turn into firewood. 50,000. That astronomical figure hung over the villagers like an invisible mountain, crushing their spirits and plunging the entire square into a deathly, suffocating silence. After years of paying exorbitant water bills, their savings were gone. They were already struggling to find money for basic necessities like pesticides and fertilizers, often owing debts to the local shops. They couldn't gather 5,000, let alone 50, even if they sold everything they owned. To be honest, it was an impossible demand. Uncle Ian asked if this was a repair or an execution, reminding Mr. Wallace that the contract promised something very different. He pointed out that the company representative, Mark, had personally assured them of reliable after-sales service and guaranteed they would repair any equipment that broke. Several villagers turned their eyes toward Mark, who was beginning to panic himself, as his own fruit orchard was the largest in the valley and at the greatest risk. We see the tension rising as the reality of their situation sets in. They were trapped by a system designed to fail them. The cooperative's promise of a modern solution for the countryside had turned into a nightmare for the farmers. It wasn't supposed to go this way, but the corporate machinery had already been set in motion. The villagers realized that these large firms were more interested in their bottom line than the survival of the crops. As the sun beat down on the dry earth, the weight of the state's regulations felt heavier than ever. And there they stood, holding nothing but empty promises and the fading hope of a harvest. To secure a $100,000 commission from the company, their dear friend Mark had made a fateful choice. He had voluntarily offered himself as the joint guarantor for the entire village's contract. Furthermore, he signed a dual-clause agreement where Section 7, Subsection 3, stated the terms quite clearly. If the community caused damage through illegal operation and failed to pay the compensation, the company had the legal right to claim the full amount directly from the guarantor, Mark. Upon hearing this, hundreds of eyes, previously filled with despair, suddenly locked onto Mark. Mark's face turned as pale as a sheet of paper as the weight of those stares hit him. He began to tremble uncontrollably. Back then, he had only cared about getting that cash. He wanted that money to build his house, so he hadn't even bothered to read the fine print. He had happily left his thumbprint on the page, but now he stammered that they were lying. He claimed it was just a promotion fee and that he didn't understand what a joint guarantor was. The manager simply asked if he was serious, noting it was all written there in black and white. With his fingerprint right there, he was told he could explain his lack of understanding to a judge. The company gave them exactly 3 days to scrape together the $50,000. If the money didn't appear in 3 days, a lawsuit and a court seizure order would follow. Those documents would be delivered directly into Mark's hands without a moment's delay. The threat was clear. If the funds weren't ready in 3 days, the legal department would strike. The court seizure order would arrive right on time for Mark to deal with the consequences. Mr. Wallace left, leaving behind hundreds of furious villagers who quickly surrounded Mark. Mark found himself trapped at his own front door, facing the town's insults for a full day and night. Inside the home of his uncle, Isaac, a new building had only recently been completed. It was a 2-story, red brick house in a foreign style, but the villagers were now reducing it to rubble. They lit a bonfire right in front of the door and began shouting the most brutal threats imaginable. They warned Isaac that if he didn't hand over the $50,000 to fix the water pump within 3 days, and if he allowed the entire village's fruit trees to wither away from a lack of water, they would start by burning his house to the ground. His son, Ian, was completely cornered. He didn't even dare to peek out from the second-story window. To be honest, who could blame him? He told his father they couldn't wait any longer, fearing the mob would actually beat them to death. The village was bone dry, but we learned that Ethan's land still had plenty of water. Ian had heard from the vegetable traders that on the wasteland Ethan had leased, he had successfully built a thriving ecological farm. He suggested they call Ethan to come back and resolve this emergency, which would conveniently save them from paying that $50,000 debt. Isaac agreed immediately, telling his son to call Ethan because, after all, he was the boy's uncle. He told himself that blood ties were stronger than anything else in this world. He was certain Ethan wouldn't just stand by and let his own uncle be harassed to death. Meanwhile, at the very top of the most luxurious hotel in the city center, Ethan was standing under a shimmering crystal chandelier, dressed in a high-end, custom-tailored suit. The hotel was hosting a high-level forum focused on the integration and development of modern agriculture and the provincial supply chain. It was a very prestigious event, naturally. As the head of a model company backed by the city, Ethan had just signed a major annual supply agreement. It was an exclusive deal worth $30 million with the largest fresh produce supermarket chain in the entire country. We see him holding a glass of champagne, chatting with the group's CEO. At that moment, his personal phone began to vibrate in his pocket, still holding his glass. He turned away and stepped into the quiet VIP lounge just outside the banquet hall. He pressed the answer button and calmly asked what was going on. On the other end, Ian panicked, shouting that a massive catastrophe had struck the village. The water pump belonging to the Lu Yuan company had apparently exploded. They had been without water for 2 days, and every fruit tree in the village was about to die. The neighbors were now blocking the door to their house, and things were getting ugly. He begged Ethan to return quickly with his old electric motor to save the day. Ian promised that if he just came back and pumped the water, everything from the past would be forgotten. He even told Ethan he could set whatever price he wanted for the water. Then Isaac took the phone, pleading as his uncle and admitting he had been wrong. He claimed he had been blinded by greed and deceived by that evil company. Yes, quite convenient. He told Ethan he couldn't possibly refuse to help people who were essentially dying. He reminded him of their blood bond, fearing the mob would bury him alive if Ethan didn't return. Ethan listened, wondering if Isaac and Ian had simply grown old and senile. Their memories seemed worse than a dog's. He reminded them of the day he left the village. He brought up that document, the voluntary waiver of liability and the division of assets. He asked them quite pointedly, who was the one who took the lead in signing it with a red thumbprint. He reminded them how they had accused him of corruption